Abby, are we ready to go?
Yep, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I am speaking from Wabanaki land. The premise of this panel is that physical retreat from present ecological danger is useless unless we retreat from the ecocidal systems of thought that have produced our present crises. How can we manage the practical and very daunting task of adaptation to climate change that doesn't leave anyone behind, while thinking through the emotional logistics of talking about the exhausting work of managing competing priorities? Our 5 panelists have dedicated their life work to resisting ecocide with the power of art and the visual. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Art can create the cultural change better than any other group. Please welcome, in order of presentation, Chalene Stevens, Nina Tushev, myself, Eliza Evans, and Bibankwe Brown. These will be 10-minute presentations followed by an open discussion. Chalene, you are on.
Good morning, and thank you, Aviva. I'm going to start, can we start the PowerPoint? Hi, so my section is titled 40 Acres and a Mule and Broken Promises, and it refers to, 40 Acres and a Mule refers to the promise that made to newly freed slaves, that promise of land, which was never fulfilled. And other broken promises refers to other promises that were broken to people of color, especially Indigenous people who had treaties broken, who were dislocated. And as a result, today, we have a problem with land rights. Next slide, please. And so my point is, I want to point out that environmental justice equals racial justice and environmental justice equals land justice. Until we have both of those, we still won't be whole. So I'm going to talk about the contributions of 4 artist activists. They are all African American, and the work that they're doing towards this justice. And the first artist, Natalie Ball. Natalie Ball is African American, and she is a member of the Klamath tribe in Oregon. And her tribe, in the Klamath tribe's territory, is at the head of the Klamath River, which leads to Klamath Lake and then leads into the Klamath River, and the river feeds into 2 tributaries into the ocean. And there are 4 tribes connected to this water source: the Karuk, the Hupa, the Yurok, and the Klamath. And we are currently going through a drought, and they're currently fighting for water rights because their water is getting siphoned off for irrigation, and they're fighting for, you know, being able to use it on their land, because a lot of our water is being displaced for large agribusiness or diverted to cities. And water rights are, you know, if you don't have water, you don't have life. And this is like part of the whole fight at Standing Rock. So the next slide. And this is a recent article in the New York Times. This is, you know, the West is currently going through a drought, and we're really talking a lot about, you know, who has rights, you know, to the water, and who has rights to use the water, and who has rights to continue to live because of water and survive. So can I have the next slide, please? This is one of Natalie Ball also recently won the Joan Mitchell Prize. I think it was in 2019. And I just wanted to show a couple of her pieces which reflect her mixed heritage. And this piece is called When I Go Missing, North Star, which has references to both her African-American and her indigenous roots. And, and takes a nod towards, towards the history of slavery and emancipation, but also, her indigenous identity. And the next slide, please. And I love this one. This is called First Cousin. And Natalie, she does these, she makes these assemblages which really reflect upon this mixed identity. And she's working, and her next projects are working towards water justice and securing that in the Klamath tribe region in Oregon. Our next artist is Kimberly B Code. Kimberly B Code was born and raised in New York. She, I think she was from Harlem. She's currently in Brooklyn. And Kimberly is more of about the local history of New York City. And there's a project that I curated that was part of a show that I curated for University of Massachusetts at Amherst at the Hampton Gallery called Current Undercurrent. And can we go to the next slide? And these are her Seneca Village pieces. And if you don't know the history of Seneca Village, this is an example about how land was taken from a Black community in what used to be Central Park and was taken by eminent domain to, the community was raised and to create at that time a space for the wealthy, green space for the wealthy residents of New York. And this is a precursor to, this has happened in a lot of places. In Los Angeles, Chavez Ravine was raised to create Dodger Stadium. This is a much older example in Seneca Village. And a lot of people don't, realize the history of New York and who were bulldozed over in order to create this, the city that it is now. And this is
Charlene, you have 4 minutes left.
Thank you. And also it's a precursor to stories of gentrification, where wealthy white residents really take land from, it's another, and so it's a precursor to the gentrification argument. Can we go to the next slide? This is Christoph Carr, and and he is a photographer in Brooklyn, and he started an organization called Black Land Ownership. Can we go to the next slide? And their mission is to centralize resources, information, and funds for Black people interested in buying land. And they raise funds and they buy rural land. And the next slide, and probably we should go two over. Yeah, Black land ownership is a human rights issue. And this and these visuals just give an example of, give a visual of the crisis of Black land ownership, that acres of private US agricultural land, Black, Native, and Hispanic people only own 2% of that. Of landowners of all private US agricultural land, only 4%. And the whole, and now we're going through this, and there's a whole battle right now where the Biden administration is trying to give aid to Black farmers who are an endangered species. And the white farmers are keeping these Black farmers from getting aid. There's no understanding of that some people might need it more, that that this is trying to cure a historic injustice. And we have next slide. And our final artist, Chalene Rodriguez, who I also curated in Current Undercurrent. And this is her, I think they were trying to create in the Bronx, gentrifying the Bronx, and the developers were trying to create something called the Piano District. And Chalene Rodriguez has been active she is a native of the Bronx, and she has been active in fighting the gentrification in their area, and also leading demonstrations at MoMA as well. And I just want to go into, I'll end this with her, next slide, with a sculpture. And this is about the water crisis in Flint and in Puerto Rico, showing how even in a wealthy nation like the United States, that not all people are guaranteed access to clean, drinkable water. And that the people who are always losing out are people of color. So I just wanted to introduce this, just saying that there are artists that not only are artists and activists, but a lot of the art is activism. And I remember back when Zanella Maholi, the South African photographic artist, said that her practice is art as activism. So in this, I believe that social change begins often with art, because that is what people are more receptive to. And it's a little softer of a blow than, just purely political speech. And using, and the art world and artists are very great, have a great talent for creating work that draws people in and makes people question the status quo. And that is the end. I just, and so all of these people, I just wanted to show what Black artists in the United States, are doing as a part of this cause, whether it's land rights, water rights, or gentrification. These are all parts of environmental justice, racial justice, and land justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Nina, are you ready to go up?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Thank you, Charlene, for this presentation. I'm very happy that I go after you, because I really was stressing how I fit in a group of artists. But speaking about art and activism, I feel much more comfortable speaking from the perspective of activism and how we've used art for that purpose. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Great. I don't have sound, but I'll share it. Okay. Okay. I hope everyone can see my presentation. Oh, I'm sorry, wait, this should not be going by itself. Okay. Forgive me, I have to make sure that it's not, okay. Try this again. Okay. Great, okay. So the presentation, I wanted to talk about how we've used art for the purpose of democratizing frontier technologies to protect people and nature. It was back in 2011 when I attended a really interesting talk at PS1, which is right here in my neighborhood in Queens. And the series of events was called Speculations, the Future Is. And this particular talk was on the future of drones. And this was 2011. The word drones had not yet come into the vernacular as it is now, except for in its context as a killer robot, what it was used for by the military. So I was very impressed by this conversation. And following that, my husband, my partner and husband, is an artist, and he designs and builds remote control airplanes. Before they were called drones, they were called remote control airplanes. And when I met him, this was something that we did a lot of our spare time. I learned how to fly them, but at the same time, I was working at the United Nations as an ally to Indigenous peoples and local communities communities inside the institution, and we were working on a project to stop deforestation. So my goal was, art was incredible, and art is very effective at the best case scenario of changing people's minds and hearts. But I kind of wasn't satisfied to stop there, because I'm more of an activist. And so I wanted to create an initiative that had a practical goal to it. So after this talk, being very inspired by it, we did create Tushar Cereals, which was an outfit initiative to train Indigenous people specifically. Those were my friends and people I worked with, and I cared about very much, to fly remote control airplanes to map, monitor, and protect their territories, mostly in the rainforest context. This is one of our early models, and we're standing on the rooftop. Interestingly enough, my workplace is right back there, the UN, as you see. So this is it was a very DIY kind of an experiment to try and see whether these early technologies, and you can see here a home-built antenna that Georgie's wearing. He's wearing video goggles, VR goggles, because wearing video goggles enables you to fly, to send the aircraft far away. You don't have to be in line of sight. And in the rainforest context, this is very important, to be able to kind of send your mind and your vision far away and gather data. These are some of the examples of the early Delta wings and airplane that we built and used. Later, in the years later, you've seen the ubiquitous and possibly annoying commercially available drones. So our practice really centers on designing, building, and customizing UAVs, call them what you will, drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, remote control craft. We also process, collect data, and create 3D models. We've also done a bunch of shows and exhibits. And as I mentioned, we've done missions and trainings, which I'll speak to in a little bit. Let me go back to why let me start with why Indigenous peoples. I was in Brazil in 2005 and was there on a mission with the UN to create a space for grassroots leaders to come together and discuss important matters related to ending biodiversity loss. And I met and became close with some leaders from the Brazilian indigenous movement. And in particular, became very close with the shaman from the Xavante people who are in the Xingu Park. The Xingu Park is one of the best preserved territories in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. And the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, even though it means, the translation of it is thick forest, it's actually one of the most deforested states in Brazil. I became friends with the shaman. We didn't speak the same language, but it didn't matter. And he reminded me of my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother, I'm originally from Bulgaria. I'm an immigrant here to this country. And my great-grandmother was the healer in our village. And I spent a lot of my days around her, very happily watching her as she was performing her ceremonies of helping people get over whatever was troubling them, whether physical or emotional ailment. And I found that connection to myself and to my own heritage in my connection to the Indigenous peoples I found. So not only that, Indigenous peoples to me are kind of the solution we need to embrace and to promote and to understand if we want to have any kind of chance to address the climate and biodiversity crises. Indigenous peoples may be only 6% of the world's population. They manage and hold tenure over 20% of the world's land surface. That might be an underestimate, of course. They support about 80% of the global biodiversity, but most importantly, it's their cosmovision and traditional knowledge that are essential to solving the biodiversity and climate crises. And I'm very happy that Bebanko is here on the panel because she'll speak directly from that perspective. But just wanted to say—
Nina, 4 minutes left.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I just wanted to briefly share with you our examples of working in the Amazon to bring this technology to Indigenous peoples. They invited us to go there and to pilot this experience of bringing this new tool and to see whether it can be used by the communities themselves to monitor and map their territories. In this particular training, this was back in 2014, in a very small village in the Amazon of Peru. The situation there was that there was an oil company actually that was settled into the village, and they were operating a pipeline. And the pipeline had burst the year before. There was a brand new burst when we went in. And so we had to fly the tool to gather evidence. We were able to do that. This is a composite image of the oil spill from the year before, which enabled us to see what the cleanup had looked like. This is a little bit of a closer up. I'm not going to play the videos, but once we obtained this data was obtained within 30 minutes. Of course, this is not possible to do on foot. It's not safe. They cannot cross into the territory of the company. It's dangerous. So the organization that was hosting us, the Indigenous Peoples Organization, just on the basis of the videos and pictures we obtained, was able to see that there were many issues of non-compliance by the company. We had a similar training and mission in the Panamanian rainforest. The issue there was that there were incursions into the Indigenous people's territory by small farmers. We were able to map, you can see the deforestation. Those were deforestation caused by ranchers coming in and just settling their cattle. I'm not gonna play the flight, but this will be available later. And as part of the mapping, we were able to get these very clear images of the two villages. If you go on Google right now, it's just a blur, and we now have this very clear image available. At the top left, you see right here is the images of the territory, the 300 acres that were mapped, overlaid on Google Earth. So it's very good in terms of visualizing where the location is and what it looks like currently. These examples were described in a couple of papers, and there's a lot of work being done, including at the UN. I'm currently supporting work to make sure that frontier technology is available to Indigenous peoples and local communities. They're able to process and produce their own data, and under laws of the rules of Indigenous data sovereignty, they can decide how to share the data, if and how. We've used art as a way to raise awareness about the use of drones, especially for, I call them good purposes or environmental purposes. We had a show in 2013 at the Queen's Museum. This was one of our early crafts that has flown and that carries a GoPro camera. It was really interesting. There was actually some pushback. Somebody wrote a letter to the director of the Queen's Museum why there's a drone in the exhibit, being that drones are used to kill people. And so we had spent a lot of time actually untangling that conglomerate of everything that is a drone is bad. And I continue doing that. This is the climate march here on the right-hand side, and part of our activism and just showing support to the cause and using that to raise awareness again about how technology can be paired with Indigenous peoples to produce some results. I wanted to just show you some eye candy. You know, this is about art, and the aerial perspective is still very fascinating, and it gives us a different perspective and a different way of perceiving the world and our environment. It's a way to pull people in to become familiar with the technology, and it's kind of like a way to get into a deeper conversation of what the technology can be used for. I know my time is running out, so I'll wrap it up here. Thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to the other presentations.
Thank you so much. You're both terrific. And pardon me, I'm in somebody else's house and their phone is ringing. It will stop soon. So I am up now. Sorry about that. Let me go back and start my screen share. When I first came to the island, I actually had a shared phone, and it was very strange. It's almost like that now. So now I'm screen sharing, and I'm going to go to full screen for you. Okay, I'm speaking from Wabanaki land, where I am a settler and guest. In 1990, I bought the former town dump on the east side of Vinyl Haven, Maine, 15 miles out to sea, and began 10 years of restoring the town dump to flourishing wetlands. This image is
Aviva,
from, yes.
we're seeing your speaker notes if you want to
Oh.
reshare.
Oh, I'm sorry. Google assured me that my presenter notes would not be visible. What do they know? All right, let me try again.
Okay.
Sorry about that. You don't need to read my mind. Let's just do a regular slideshow. Okay, so this is what the dump looked like. And in the corner, you can see.
Sorry, now we're not seeing the screen at all.
Oh, geez, what can I tell you? All right, let me get out of here. And sorry about this. Heck.
I can share them if that would help you.
No, it wouldn't, because you have a different one. So let me just.
Okay.
So I'm going to start my screen share all over. Is that correct?
That's great. Yeah, that would work great.
Okie dokie. Let me do that.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that cool? Can you?
Yeah,
All
we
right.
can see it if we just present.
Slideshow. Ugh, why is it not going to slideshow? All right, we'll have to make do.
Okay, great.
Okay, so
go ahead.
Thank you. So this is what the town dump looked like. It was all made land in 1930. It wasn't much different when I bought it. And this is a detail of the restored wetlands. This is what the terrain looked like when I restored the estuary on the site. And for the first time in 100 years, freshwater met saltwater. And in the insert, you see my studio, which is actually on made land. And at least twice in the past 30 years, it has been surrounded by seawater. And since I can't afford to move all my art, that means that one day it may all wash out to sea, which is a good metaphor for what's going to happen to us all. So out of that work, I developed a complex adaptive model, which had 6 rules. And the point of the model was to identify where a small point of intervention could affect a large systemic change. And those 6 rules are: there will be a small point of entry into any chaotic system. The paradox of urgency is that there is time to change. We can layer information to test perception. Metaphors are idea models. There will be critical disruptions in sensitive initial conditions, and play will teach. So in the restoration for the Ghost Nets project, there were 3 primary restoration concerns: water access and purity, the large biogeographic contiguity of the Maine coast, and conserving habitat ecotones. And let's move along here. And here is an example of a piece of art that is a metaphor for an idea model. These are the drift nets that do get loose from the boats. They continue to strip mine the ocean, and I think they are an analogy for the familiar habits and routines that kill us all. So in the untangling of chaos around the world, this is a still from a film that I did with Jim White in 2007, applying this idea of trigger point theory to various deltaic zones to figure out where would be the point of intervention. We decided it was ultimately in Iowa because of factory farming. And this is what has really driven me since 2015, the whole experience of watching deforestation across the planet. And this is a detail of the dynamited dump that I bought in 1990. This is not advancing the way it should. This is a schematic over an aerial of the riparian zone from exactly the same place when I started trying to analyze what kind of trajectory I needed to restore for the riparian zone. And these are a couple
details, including the one that was inset just shot last night, of what the same part of the site looked like 30 years later. And this is from another site also on Vinyl Haven, where I applied the same theoretical premises to restore ultimately about 30 acres of land, wetlands land, and that was funded by the USDA for $500,000, and it has been a tremendously productive habitat. This is just a detail of one of a series of installations where I tracked the relationship between open land that could be restored and watersheds across the North American continent. And this is the application of trigger point theory with GIS to restore finfish abundance in the Gulf of Gulf of Maine. This is from some current work on fire regimes with the modeler Olivia Haas in the UK, funded by Arts Cabinet. And what we're trying to look at is the possibility of thinking about fire not as the threat we experience it as, but as the necessary alpha predator that maintains habitat equilibrium. This is a work in progress map that envisions the fires as fire tigers, and the blue is all the vegetative cover that is most productive and the fires need as forage to survive. So it didn't take me too long to figure out that restoration was not enough. I had to be helpful in changing the law and policy. And these were the three issues I had to deal with in order to bring my cases to court. One was my standing in the general discourse. Another was the permanence of the work in the environment. And the third was my intentions to make it about common good and cultural values rather than my own ego. And this was some of the material that was submitted for copyright registration. And I'm just going to play you a tiny bit of the composition that evolved out of the aerial distribution. Yep, sorry. Do you want more? I'll do a little bit more. Sorry. And these were people from one of the teams that were painting the trees. Each tree was painted with a sigil of a vertical sine wave, and that was in discrete measures, each 1/3 mile long. The trees corresponded to tree notes, and that was what created the composition. And this is how I envisioned it, as the score interpolated with the trees. So there were hundreds of trees that were painted across many sites across North America. And this is how I envisioned that composition in relation to the globe. And I'm just going to play you a tiny bit of the coda for the symphony. And let me just wait a minute. Let me just get to the right part. No.
Sorry, I had trouble inserting that audio, so I don't have it for you to hear. But what we did was we reiterated the melody over and over again, going higher and higher in registers. And in between those registers, there was a recitation of the legal issues that we were concerned with in the whole project. This is from.
Aviva, you have 3 minutes, okay?
Thank you. I'm almost done. This was from the installation I did in South Korea, which was just a meditative environment with immersive bird song and suspended local quince branches to make it difficult for people to get to the map. The photo collage is of what will remain of refugia after sea level rise. So we took these ideas to court. We took it to a mock trial at the Cardozo School of Law, and we won an injunction from the Bronx Supreme Court Judge April Neubauer. And the whole point of the exercise was to reconsider the relationship between ownership as copyright and ownership as eminent domain. Our intention was to challenge the basis on which corporations take land to create ecocide. And that, my friends, is it. But you can look up my websites at these locations. And I hope I'm stopping a little bit early so that we have lots of time for discussion. Eliza, you're up.
Great, thank you. Let's see. I'll just share my screen. Let me get on the right project. Great. Well, I'm here presenting mostly as an artist today, but I do have a background in economic sociology. I'm a bit of a lapsed academic. And for the last number of years, I have been making art related, either directly or indirectly related to environmental systems and climate change. But I created All the Way to Hell last year, really at the beginning of the pandemic, to help me solve a personal problem. And I turned it into an art project that I call All the Way to Hell. And this is the nature of the problem. I inherited 3 mineral acres in Oklahoma, a place I have never been. And I started getting letters from land agents for fossil fuel companies wanting to lease these acres so that they could frack them and extract whatever resources they found below. And I, exploring some options to refuse them, I found out that I couldn't really. 3 acres, especially for us city dwellers, seems like quite a lot, but in oil terms, it's nothing. And so I created this little graphic just to illustrate that. So there's my 3 acres, which is just within a 150 acre lot, which is itself within a 640 acre, what they call a drilling unit. So that's the amount of acres a fossil fuel company has to lock up in order to drill for oil. And why 640 acres? That's a square mile. So it's so even though 1 well can be 3 miles deep and 2 miles across these days, we're still dependent on these rather anachronistic measurements. So I was told I could not say no, and they could force me. And it's you might be familiar with eminent domain. This forced pooling works a little differently, but it's in principle something highly analogous. So I could not say no, but I didn't. I'm an artist, and so my job is to figure things out. And So I created All the Way to Hell in an art context, which turned out to be very useful because the rest of the world perhaps doesn't take art so seriously. So we have a lot more latitude to play and experiment and perhaps insult and break. And as an artwork, it first appeared on a gallery wall in Chelsea from May through September last year. And very simply, what I was doing was prompting the viewer to help me and to claim ownership of a small portion of these 3 acres. So I'm giving away the 3 mineral acres to 1,000 people. And what this means is the fossil fuel company will have to track down all of those new owners, attempt to negotiate a lease. The new owners can completely ignore them. And it adds enormously to the overhead of drilling a well in this particular location. And for those of you who don't know, fracking companies are barely making any money as it is now. So any administrative burden, however slight, just cuts into their profits. So additionally, the people who actually are negotiating the leases are contractors. And they may not even know who their client is. So if they go into the county clerk's office and see 1,000 names owning this one specific 3-acre mineral property, they're just going to walk away because of the way they're compensated. It's just not a viable business for them. So the image on the left is how it was displayed in the gallery. The other 2 images are, actually, this is still a work in progress. It will open in a couple days. And that gravel pad is exactly the size of the mineral property that the volunteers will own. But there's another important component to this project, or anything having to do with mineral rights, is the very peculiar approach that the United States has taken to private property ownership as it relates to mineral rights. So it's based on common law, and the Latin phrase is whoever's in this soil, it is theirs, all the way to heaven and all the way to hell. So in theory, mineral owners own the property to the center of the earth, which is roughly 4,000 miles. So while participants in the project will own approximately 120 square feet, it will be 4,000 miles deep. And so just for grins, I'm calling this the largest collaborative land art project ever conceived. I have no idea if that's true or not, but conceptually, it just activates the imagination, because we can't touch it, we can't feel it, you can't camp on this property. It does not include the surface, which is another peculiarity of US law, where the surface rights and the mineral rights can be severed. So it could be that the farmer or the rancher of the land does not own the minerals beneath. Mineral property is superior to surface property, which means in order to get access to the minerals, an oil company can come in and set up shop and put a drill on that person's land, even though they get very little benefit from it. So this,
Eliza,
yes,
you have 4 minutes.
Oh, thanks so much. So that's the kind of my primer on the non-industries person primer to how fracking and the oil industry works in the US on private property. So what I'm basically doing is piloting a method for a 100-year sit-in, reimagining property, in that it is something we can hold in collaboration with one another, in accordance to our values, and try to get in the way of oil and gas development. And because this is a very legally fastidious project, I call, instead of civil disobedience, it's uncivil obedience. So I've spent a lot of time making sure this coheres legally. But people are still finding room to make it their own. For example, without unbidden from me, people are signing up their children to own these mineral rights. so that they have, it's a way the parent is communicating their values and their notions of care to their children. It also this is real ownership. I've had, a couple of millennials and Gen Z folks sign up because this will be the first property they own in their life, and perhaps the only in their own view. So they're finding other meaning in this work that makes me really pleased to hear. So while I designed this project to help me solve a very particular problem and to model a legal intervention, it's a multi-year project. I'm just coming to the end of year one. Getting into the history is really critical for me. This is, obviously, territory belonging to Native peoples, and recently affirmed in a 2020 Supreme Court decision. This is an unceded land of the Muskogee Nation. And in terms of criminal justice proceedings, this is an intact nation. So I'm really curious to see if the Muskogee Nation can push this in terms of mineral rights. And their ability to monitor and tax the mineral rights within all of northeastern Oklahoma. Also, we just passed the centennial of the Tulsa massacre, which is, so I'm sure all or most of us are aware of it at this point, and the enormous wealth created by Black Wall Street in Tulsa. But a lot of that wealth came from owning mineral rights. And of course, they were violently and forcibly divested of those assets. I have begun research online to see how, where those absences might appear in the property record, but frankly, I've got to go there and do some on-site research to continue that. So, so this particular land, which is not in Tulsa, but adjacent to it, is certainly wrapped up in this really violent and contentious history that is still very much unreformed, unresolved, and barely acknowledged. So this is, my name is Eliza Evans. These are all the ways to get in touch. This will be, again, this is just the first year of a project I expect to consume me obsessively for the next couple of years. And I welcome any participants or any dialogue. So thanks for letting me present.
Thank you so much, Eliza. And now Bibakwe, you are up.
Dansei. So due to technical restraints, Eliza is going to play my slideshow for me. So you could start that anytime.
Sorry, just a second.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to go ahead and start talking while you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Line that up.
Yeah.
So, Nitsiga-san Pipon, Dansei, Nitsiga-san Hio Matatakwan Oasis, Nehio Esqueo, Amisquachua Skygan Ochinia, Napo King Ochinia, Kawingana Walomwa, Ninda Shinzi Loan, Ninau Jiayi, Napo King, Ninau Jiayi, Amisquachua Skygan. Hello, my name is Bibonkwe in Anishinaabe, Pipon in Cree, Plains Cree, and winter in English, and in Lenape it is Loan. And I'm currently based in Brooklyn, New York, which is Lenape, Muncie, Delaware territory. I am originally from Plains Cree territory, Amisquachua Skygon, aka Beaver Hill House, also known as Edmonton in northern Alberta. And I'm Anishinaabe, Plains Cree Métis woman, and my cultural affiliation is Plains Cree. And I also have Scottish and Russian ancestors. And I also want to acknowledge that here on in Napo King, in Lenape territory, I'm on unceded Lenape territory. We're talking in this conference about, displacement and the need to move. And I want to acknowledge that the Lenape people have been almost completely displaced from their traditional territories here through colonial and genocidal processes. And this land was never traded for a few beads. There's never been a treaty made. That's settler propaganda that unfortunately still persists to this day and really needs to be upended. I'm a contemporary artist, and I've been making work for quite a number of, decades at this point. My work is very much embodies and is seated in and expresses and continues my culture, but in a contemporary way. So in doing that, it reflects our traditional Indigenous paradigms. So contrary to, I guess, like a lot of stereotypes about Native culture, it's not something static. We've always been incorporating new media, new technologies, and new cultures, but while being able to maintain the strong cultural foundations. And it's those cultural foundations that have allowed us to survive in the face of what really are almost insurmountable odds of what we've experienced on our own territories here on Turtle Island. For anyone who doesn't know, that's North America, what's currently known as North America. In just a few short generations, we have lost, low estimate, say 100 million people through colonial genocidal processes. And this still goes largely unacknowledged. And also very much in relation to the topic of this conference is the fact that in that process, most Indigenous peoples have been hugely displaced and forced onto, areas of land that are minuscule in relationship to our long-standing traditional territories. Also, I forgot, I wanted to just acknowledge and give thanks to my co-panelists for inviting me and making it possible for me to be part of this, and also to Columbia and the people who organized this conference, hi, for having us and me and allowing us this space to talk. So I've been feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the amount there is to talk about in relation to the topic of managed retreat, and at the same time presenting my work. And so I had a whole talk recorded, and I've decided instead that I'm going to first focus on just sharing about my work, because I feel like it's completely entwined with and talks and addresses and holds the information that I feel is relevant to this. So as you hopefully have been able to see from these images and also the materials, in making my work, I'm often very much collaborating with what we call our relations. So that's like elements from the plant nations, elements from the animal nations, elements from what is now, called Western technology, but with the recognition that all of those materials come from the earth, that she's providing everything we have, both in the physical world and very much also in the spirit, in the spiritual sense as well. And I also wanted to focus on, so in some of the earlier pieces, I'm collaborating with caribou, moose, deer, by working with antlers, working with vines, roots, and putting them into what appear to be contemporary Western contexts, but are also very, very much foundationally made from Indigenous perspective and paradigm. This series is one that I wanted to focus on today. It's a newer series that I started working on during the pandemic lockdown and the Black Lives Matters protests, and it's Entangled drawing series. So as an Indigenous person, I found elements of those experiences to be very disturbing, additional layers to the existing constant navigating and the challenges of navigating, colonized environment on our own territories. In the conversations about this pandemic, I watched as, conversations about the impacts of the pandemic, which were very real and very deep. At the same time, Indigenous relationship to pandemics, which is in our very recent history, those millions and millions of people that we lost were largely through pandemics. And yet this is still almost completely left out of mainstream conversation and acknowledgement. And even though this happened on our territories, and in the case of smallpox in particular, this was purposely perpetrated. And if anybody needs, sort of solid affirmation of that, there's written history of that from, colonial history. In addition to that,
you have 3 minutes left, okay?
Okay, yeah. In addition to that, I watched as very necessary conversations started to happen around racial inequity and brutality against Black people. But at the very same time, I watched, time and time again on mainstream media anyway, as Black leadership spoke about racial issues and completely omitted Indigenous history, issues and presence out of the conversation. And that made me hyper aware of this issue that, to my mind, there is no managed retreat from ecocide. What we need is a deep accountability and acknowledgement of the colonial process, of Indigenous presence, of the fact that we have been here. When we say from time immemorial, like this length of time in relationship to people having lived here for a few hundred years, when our whole cultures are based in relationship to the land, we have always put the earth at the center. And contained in that and foundational to that is that this is a spiritual relationship. And in any conversation about how to navigate what we call the earth changes, which are now escalating and will continue to escalate unimaginably, much more quickly than I think most non-native people, even scientists, really understand, because this is a living being and she's been being abused. So these situations contained within the pandemic really made me yet again, like, focus on in these drawings, the entanglement of all of these issues with the lack of acknowledgement and the ignoring of Indigenous presence and knowledge is part of the colonial genocidal process. And until, the history of this genocide comes from people coming from different locations to get away from abusive cultural patterns. And they are embedded in relationship to the land. So until that is acknowledged, you can only retreat for a few more minutes before there is nowhere left to retreat to, because things will be in such an intense state. The earth is really, really angry and hurting. So I'm calling for that. I feel like there's a deep necessity for people to deal with their guilt, to deal with their own histories. You can only heal that by really looking at it, understanding it. I feel like there's a need to reframe, you know, the colonial mind frame is embedded in the language and the media and the culture. So even I repeatedly hear the term, you know, humanity applied to like, oh, well, that's just how humanity rolls, to like hurt each other and abuse the earth. Meanwhile, we have cultures that have been here for thousands upon thousands of years, living holistically and healthily in relationship with the earth and all our relations. And there are also cultures like that in Western Europe, pre-Christian cultures that have been primatized in the same way that Indigenous and Black cultures have. You know, that needs to be really addressed, you know, cracked open, acknowledged. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that because I just feel like there's so much to talk about in 10 minutes. Is just not even the tip of the iceberg. So I'm going to leave it open to questions to just see where this conversation might lead. If anybody has any questions about the artworks, go from there.
Thank you all for amazing presentations of your amazing work. And as you know, I'm referring to my fellow panelists, I prepared some questions for us all, but I'm not sure whether we should actually first go to questions between the panelists or questions from our audience. Abby, do we have questions from an audience?
I'll start to send them to you as they come in, but if you want to start with the questions that you prepared, that's great.
Okay, let me do that. But let me first ask, is there anybody on the panel that has an urgent question for somebody else? Okay, I'm going to launch into the few questions that I assembled. The first one is, how do any of us talk with people who are willing to defend their entitlement claims to the death? So anybody who has experience with that can comment.
I guess I'll start. Well, if someone wants to defend something to the death, they might not be open to a conversation. I mean, if they are, I think that education is the best way to bring someone in a more neutral or position to be able to receive some knowledge. So I guess instead of being confrontational, because if someone feels entitled and you just say, oh, you're acting entitled, or you're just a colonist, I think that shuts people down, because a lot of people don't, you know, they may have some unsavory positions or ideas, but no one, but I mean, I'm comparing this to like when, you know, how people are getting called out on their racism, where the conversation shuts down when you just call someone racist, because racist is being equated with being a bad person, and no one wants to see themselves as a bad person. And so if you start the conversation calling someone a bad person, they're only going to dig in their heels and get defensive, and no one's listening to anyone.
Good.
So, like, so I mean, the first thing is like, don't start with name calling, don't start with labeling, and just be able to, you know, present some facts. And I'm going to say in a loving manner, because I guess if you're willing to actually speak to them, there is some love in there, because there are people that I'm willing to have a discussion with, and there are some people that I'm just not going to bother. But I think just doing it lovingly, doing it without labels, without name calling, without implying that they are a bad person, but maybe some of their actions or positions may be hurting people. And I think everyone responds to pain. Everyone feels pain. And a lot of people don't realize that what they are doing or saying causes pain. And if you can help them understand that, and how words, thoughts, and actions affect other people, I think that might be a step in being able to reach across the aisle.
What you touch on, Charlene, is the fact that all of us who have an activist aspect to our practice are basically in the realms of sociology and psychology, which requires us all to be just as introspective as anything we expect from anybody else. That's not usually taught in art school.
No. And I guess we're also doing PR, as far if we want to get someone to come to the cause, we need to sell it. And art's a great way to sell it. Art, people are disarmed when they are approaching art, as opposed to approaching, a highly political or governmental situation, because we all, think that art is to be enjoyed. And so when people are viewing art, they're more open to a message than throwing facts and articles and positions and statements. I really think people are a lot more receptive to visual culture.
Although I would take issue with your phrase about the softer blow. I like art that hits hard myself. Would anybody else like to comment on this question?
Yeah, I'll comment. I have a somewhat contradictory position, partly because from a cultural vantage point, my teachings anyway, my understanding is that in Indigenous cultures, we often don't, it's seen as disrespectful to like try to push your opinion or your position on somebody else. And you could kind of see it in relation to the saying, like, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I mean, for hundreds of years now, we've been dealing with cultures coming in and not listening to what we had to say, even though, as far as I'm concerned, the proof is in the pudding. After thousands and thousands of years of living in balance with our environments and with each other, even though I think it's become more PC to be, acknowledging Native people, the perceptions about us and our cultures are still so deeply embedded, and we didn't manage that by being uncivilized or backward or just primitive. It's because of the sophistication of our cultures, right? But did speaking up have any effect on the mass genocide and ecocide that has happened on the planet? So we're dealing now with the mainstream culture is a culture of denial, right? And I put that very much, I'm going to keep going back to histories of abuse, right? Abusiveness embedded in behavioral cultural patterns. So if you relate that to a person who's experienced abuse in their family history, the way of coping with abuse is denial. So how do you speak to not only a person, but communities who are embedded in denial? They have to be ready. And that readiness, from where I'm sitting and many Indigenous people are sitting, it's not gonna, when you put that in relation to topics like managed retreat and ecocide, it's not that like awakening from denial, the way at the speed it's going right now, it's still en masse. It's still the majority, right? It's not going to happen in time to stop. Like, we're beyond the tipping point environmentally already, in terms of massive earth changes coming very quickly. So I'm speaking without an answer. I'm just speaking from perspective of how deeply challenging and contradictory that is, right?
Bibakwe, I know that you have an encyclopedia of knowledge and insight, but I want to give it, and I love listening to you. But I want to give a chance to Nina and Eliza if they have something to say on this topic. And I'm tracking the time at 11:45. I want to open it up to audience questions so that we have time for that as well.
Hi.
I feel guilty for cutting you off.
No, I was done. I was handing it over. So
I guess while they're getting ready, I wanted to mention also that when my presentation, and I was thinking what Babankwe was saying in hers about, you know, Black Lives Matter wasn't looking at Indigenous people, but the point of my presentation, which I guess I didn't really just say, is that I was, and especially with like Natalie Ball's, but the issues of African Americans and Indigenous Americans are very much intertwined, and the histories are very much intertwined. Where Natalie Ball is an African American and Indigenous, there are, you know, the whole, you know, we've both been denied, you know, land, even though this wasn't, you know, my ancestors' land. But, and also just our histories, like, you know, escaped slaves that found refuge with Indigenous people, or there were Indigenous people who owned Africans as slaves. Like, I was just reading an article about, you know, the Trail of Tears had Black people, you know, as well. And also this whole thing with the intertwined, we also have these intertwined crises. Like, and if you look at like the state of Florida, for example, very Republican, you know, very Trumpy, but this is where you have a lot of conservatives who are concerned about ecocide because it's happening to them. And I mean, I hate to say, but people really get concerned about things when it's happening to them. You know, that's like the opioid crisis. Oh, well, it's happening to white people. It's a crisis now. Well, that's what's also happening, you know, with ecocide, where you have a lot, I mean, people are beginning to come around. I mean, conservatives like clean water and their land too. You know, conservatives don't like their beaches washing away, you know.
Charlene, I'm going to cut you off because I want to give a chance to Nina and Eliza, and I am tracking the time.
Okay.
And there's just 1 minute until 11:45. So I'd like to invite either Eliza or Nina, if you'd like to comment on this. And the next question is the last question I would ask is, how do we reconcile competing grievances? Everybody has legitimate grievances. So would either one of you like to respond?
Well, I'd like to draft off of Charlene's comment a little bit because it's clearly a lot of confrontation is required, but there's also opportunities for some rather strange and potentially productive alliances. Like, it's not only conservatives, but it's the entire insurance industry. It's the entire finance industry. And so I think it's actually the actuary who is forcing a lot of businesses who might not appreciate what's happening, but when they see their rates go up, you know, several 100%, or their businesses will just be uninsurable, because actuaries do believe in science. And while it's a very different understanding of property and how you know, natural systems interact with each other, it's still we all need to manage risk, and I think we have to use everything we have. And so I can see, you know, very strange alliances coming out of this to bring about change. And I think we have to have new alliances, and starting with people where they are in each specific context. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Before we go to audience questions, Nina, would you like to add anything to this?
Thank you so much. No, I think that I agree with Charlene that in my work it's kind of like going to what people care about. The way to everyone cares about something, and sometimes at the UN it's difficult for us to talk to a government who even refuse to recognize that they have indigenous peoples. I mean, what do you do with that? Or there's some others that I've heard who say we're all indigenous. So the ways that the erasure continues to occur are many, and the strategies have to be equally as varied, which is why I'm even joining a band. I'm not an artist like you guys are, in that sense, but I care about this issue, and would join any place to be able to talk about it. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, these issues are enormous and we're not going to solve them today, but we can kind of put a tiny little pin into them. Abby, do you have, oh, I see there's one already.
Yeah, I'll start sending them to you.
Thank you very much. So there's a question for Bibankwe. The braid shows up in your work. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yes, thank you for noticing that. So culturally, there are kind of visual racial stereotypes about Native people, and I sometimes joke that they're both can be both damaging and true at the same time. The braid is one of them. Obviously, traditionally, a lot of people wear their hair in braids. We braid our sweetgrass, which is used for prayer. And the symbolism of those three strands is the balancing of mind, body, and spirit. So I'm, taking that into account when I'm making the pieces. But the first piece, the rubber braid, is actually made from recycled inner tube rubber from bicycle inner tubes, which I've used in my work a lot for years. So it's like I meticulously cut the inner tubes into strands and then braid them. And I it's kind of like a deconstruction of Western technology. I call it re-indigenizing technologies. And the double-endedness, it's like, it kind of leaves it for an open-ended conversation. It's like, where did that come from? Was it cut from somebody? Is it part of a grieving process? Is it just an abstract sculpture? It has a latent performative element. I've used it in a piece where I'm actually, a photographic piece where I'm holding it out to the audience. And I also made them, with the intention of positioning them in both urban and rural locations. So you saw a photograph of one of the braids. It's actually in Prospect Park in the forest, but they also can be situated in urban environments. Yeah.
I'm going to take another question. Is the concept language of managed retreat inherently colonial? How to address the issue of disaster-prone areas without digging on past, is that right? On past trauma.
Is that for me?
I'd like to hear from somebody else, maybe, who hasn't spoken very much. Eliza, would you like to address that?
Sure. Going back to some work I did more than 20 years ago on refugees management and resettlement. So a different mode of crisis, but there were refugee, 40-year-old refugee camps for people who escaped, one bad situation and landed in another. And what the findings were is that people who had to resettle for whether natural, the cause was natural or political or war, people who managed they self-settled, they avoided the camps, they avoided the planned response to their crisis, did much better. They self-settled, they learned the local language, their kids went to the local schools. And while it could have been very difficult and certainly traumatic, they ended up integrated in a way that the refugees in the camps did not. And so I think that we can plan I mean, we're kidding ourselves. I think the focus should be on adaptation. This is going to inflict enormous pain, and we know on certain people more than others, and we have to do what we can to ameliorate that. Yeah, but so ask big questions like, does adaptation and justice require open borders? You know, we know that's that issue, that question, along with many others, are going to be forced. And I think in our political environment right now, we know what the answer is likely to be, even though we know what the just answer is.
Thank you. And what is the perspective of the panelists, especially Bebankwe, on restoring land rights, sovereignty, stewardship to tribal and indigenous communities in the areas that people are moving away from? Is it too little, too late, or even insulting? And I can add to that that's a very interesting question, because it implies all the issues that came up with putting people on reservations, that people are taken to the least desirable lands. Bebankwe, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complex and loaded question. My first thought is that even on the table? Is that happening? I've not heard of it happening, but perhaps it is. I mean, I think the thing is, first of all, you have to always acknowledge whose traditional territory is that, right? But yes, and also, you know, over the span of long periods of time, we're also, depending on which nation you're from, historically nomadic and semi-nomadic more often than not. And territories were also in flux, but that does not negate the deep, deep, long-standing relationship with land, and that being able to live in good relationship with the land does depend on, you know, deep local interaction and knowledge. Like, I'm aware that even our languages are certain areas of Turtle Island speaking through us, and we say that our cultures are contained in our language. Like, the interrelationship is almost indescribable in Western terms and Western way of thinking, and I use Western for lack of a better word. So you know, there are issues and problems that just can't be solved again by Western mind frame. It really does a lot come down, or foundationally come down to, like, spiritual relationship too, right? So a problem like that question embodies, there's no technical fix to it, right? If lands are being taken by the ocean and that's somebody's traditional territory, well, I would say that, you know, pre-contact, those peoples would be, you know, absorbed into surrounding communities. But pre-contact, that wouldn't happen in the first place because there wouldn't be those abuses to the land. Yeah, so there's so much complexity in it. Does that,
That's
I
a
don't think
wonderful
there's an answer to that question, but
I think it's a wonderful answer. One of the things I commented yesterday in one of the breakout sessions for networking was that the one thing that I thought was hopeful that I see coming out of this conference is that people are willing to talk about complexity, and they're willing to talk about the issues in depth. And somebody mentioned that that's because of the pandemic. I don't know whether it is or it isn't, but that to me is the essential attitudinal change that we all have to address. We pretty much have to wrap up, which I hate because I know how much you each have to continue to talk about. I'm very grateful to Abby and to the conference in general that we had this chance to present and talk. Yes. I'm very honored that I had the chance to work with you all, including Abby. And I hope that we will find some way to continue these conversations. And I'd like to invite anybody who'd like to make any last comments to do so.
Hi.
Was that the beginning of a comment or that was the comment?
Oh, comment came up in the chat.
No, I was asking you whether you wanted to say more.
Oh, well, when I was speaking, because I just felt so time pressured, I did want to just respond briefly to Charlene's response to what I was saying about what I saw happening during Black Lives Matter. Is I was also aware that that was what was being shown on mainstream media, right? So I hope that was an influence on why almost all the conversations from Black leadership were omitting Indigenous issues. I'm deeply aware of that interaction that we've had in the past. And I'm also, grateful for people in the Black community who are acknowledging Indigenous issues, but I just feel like there's way more room for that. And I just want to emphasize in what my emphasis on that was to the accountability part, that abusive patterns in settler cultures come from somewhere. Everybody is enacting those. That's what the colonial process is. That's its source, right? So that was the thing that I'm aiming at in that conversation.
Thank
Oops.
you.
Hi.
Is there somebody else who would like to make any closing comments?
Oh, no, well, Buckley, thank you for clarifying, and I guess, and thank you for inviting me, Aviva. I appreciate this, and it was great to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Abby is saying that there were a lot of positive comments from the crowd. And I hope somehow we'll get some access to those because we all love to be praised.
Hi. And hi, Anushik, to everybody for this great talk, and Aviva for pulling us together, and to the organizers again. Yeah, hi, Anushik.
Yes.
My
Amen.
co-panelist.
Amen. Yeah, you guys are terrific. This is such important stuff, and you're each doing such important work. And what I loved about putting this panel together was how different your strategies are. And Nina, if you have any question about whether you're an artist or not, I'd say you're an artist.
Thank you.
You're willing to add that label to yourself.
Thank you. Topic of another panel.
Yes.
Who is an artist?
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aviva, and
Oh,
thank
I
you.
also just wanted to say real quick, Charlene, I'm a huge fan of Natalie Ball, and I'm so glad that you shared her work.
Oh,
her
great.
work.
I will be having her on one of my Wednesday talks.
Oh,
So,
cool. Awesome.
yeah, I'll definitely, now that I have your email, I'll definitely send you the announcement, because I just asked her to participate in one. And so
awesome.
she'll have a whole hour with me.
Wow, great, right on. That's something to look forward to.
Great.
Eliza, do you have anything you'd like to add as we close?
I'm good, but this was a terrific panel and I really enjoyed meeting everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have all educated me, and I'm happy to be educated, and I hope that our audience feels the same way. And Abby, I think you can take us out. We're done.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.